The inside of shaft 972 was extremely dark. The light from the lamp attached to his hat was not enough to fully illuminate the darkness of the shaft. Xian stood facing the wall at the dead end of the shaft. Marks left by pickaxe blows remained on the wall. They were traces left behind by someone who had entered before Xian. He could almost see the sight of a miner who had entered this underground place where not a single ray of sunlight reached in order to mine mana stones, swinging his pickaxe down with all his strength. 4 miners like that had died here.
Why?
The miners would not have died for no reason. There had to be something here that had led them to their deaths. There was no such thing as an effect without a cause. Xian leaned the pickaxe against the wall and began carefully examining the inside of the shaft.
The mana is dense, but...
A great deal of mana had gathered inside the shaft. If it had been before Xian awakened, he would not have noticed it.
Why is mana gathered only here?
He had heard that side effects appeared when ordinary people were exposed to mana for a long time. Cellular necrosis caused by mana oversaturation, the rapid aging of organs, and countless other side effects besides. If what he felt was true, then the miners had clearly died because of the mana in this place. Park Man-ho wasn't awakened too, so if he had entered this place, he would certainly have felt that mana was excessively concentrated here. However, he had fallen into gambling and had not personally entered the shafts for a long time. That had to be why he had failed to notice. The problem was why mana had gathered only in this place. Xian looked at the wall of the shaft. For now, that wall was the only place worth suspecting. Xian picked up the pickaxe. Then he struck the inner wall of the shaft. The pickaxe clanged and sparked as it struck, and sparks scattered in every direction. Each time he swung the pickaxe down, the rock crumbled weakly. Then with one swing, the pickaxe produced a different sound, a thunk, and he felt it sink unusually deep.
What is this?
With a puzzled expression, Xian swung the pickaxe down with all his strength once more. The wall collapsed with a tremendous roar. In the place where the wall had crumbled, an oval space was rippling. At the appearance of the space, which was especially black and alien, like the throat of a beast, Xian's eyes widened.
What the?
At that instant, a powerful force pulled Xian in. Before Xian could even resist, he was sucked into the black space. The moment he entered, he felt tremendous pressure. Pain, as though his entire body were being crushed, swept over him. His mind went blank, and agony crashed over him so fiercely that he could not continue thinking. All he could think was that he wanted to escape this moment as quickly as possible. Fortunately, that moment came quickly. The black space expelled him violently. Xian rolled across the ground several times, then quickly got to his feet.
What is this hellish scenery?
Until just moments ago, he had clearly been deep inside an underground shaft. Yet now, an entirely different scene stretched out before his eyes. In the distance, he could see an enormous mountain. The mountain, black as pitch, was spewing black smoke and crimson lava. The sky was filled with volcanic ash, and rivers of lava flowed across the earth. All the plants had burned to ash, and the air was full of the smell of sulfur. Intense heat rose from the earth where the lava had hardened. It was tremendous enough that the heat of the desert could not even compare. In an instant, Xian's face flushed bright red and sweat poured down like rain. Before he knew it, his clothes were damp with sweat.
Is this a dungeon?
Xian looked at the entrance to the dungeon that had spat him out. The dungeon entrance was closing at great speed, as though it had fulfilled its role.
Damn it. No.
By the time Xian ran over, it had closed completely, and not even a trace remained.
This is driving me insane.
Xian scratched his head roughly. Entering a dungeon was one thing, but he had never imagined he would end up inside one so defenselessly. Even in Neo Soul, people made thorough preparations when conquering a dungeon. They estimated the grade through the dungeon's scale, then formed a raid party with awakened suitable for that grade. Even after entering with every preparation made, dungeons were places that produced tremendous casualties. It was only natural that he was dumbfounded after being dropped alone into such a dungeon with no preparation at all.
This is truly a perfectly rotten day. How can I possibly be this unlucky?
It was so absurd that he was beyond speechless, starting with Old Man Klexi taking his mana stone from him for a pittance, then his ill-fated connection with Park Man-ho, and now being dragged into a dungeon without warning. Everything was perfect. as if a god who adjusted fate were personally directing the situation. Zeon took out the hourglass he had placed in his pocket and looked at it.
Is this the only thing I managed to gain, at least?
As he fiddled with the hourglass, his mind calmed slightly. Only then could he think coldly.
First, I need to check whether my ability works inside the dungeon.
Zeon bent at the waist and swept the ground with his hand. Black grains stuck to his hand. It was volcanic ash. Zeon raised his control. Then the sand in his hand slowly rose into the air. Fortunately, it seemed volcanic ash fell within the reach of his control, just like sand. Zeon thought it was a relief. It would have been troublesome if his greatest weapon, his control over sand, did not work. The dungeon was filled with volcanic ash. Weapons for him to use were scattered everywhere. Zeon let out a sigh of relief. At least it did not seem as though he would die helplessly. The next thing Zeon did was check inside his backpack. Fortunately, there were several days' worth of food inside. It was a relief that the food had not spoiled or been ruined while passing through the dungeon entrance.
With this much, I should be able to hold out for a few days.
Now that he had confirmed there was no problem with his food, what remained was finding the dungeon's exit. The problem was that he had no idea where the exit was in this vast space. In a case like this, there was only one method. He had to walk around and check for himself.
Most likely, it will be near the volcano, right?
No matter who looked at it, the center of this dungeon was the volcano. If so, there was surely a clue to escaping the dungeon at the volcano.
Phew.
Zeon took a deep breath. His throat stung. The volcanic ash drifting in the air was irritating his airway. If he could not escape quickly, the volcanic ash would surely ruin his lungs. Zeon took a piece of cloth from his backpack. It was a cloth used as a substitute for a mask to prevent the inhalation of stone dust while mining mana stones. When he covered his mouth and nose with the cloth, the pain in his airway lessened a little.
Let's go.
Zeon moved toward the volcano. The more he looked, the stranger it seemed. He knew that a dungeon was a space where human common sense did not apply, but he had never known it would be a place this incomprehensible. The enormous volcano visible in the distance was neither an illusion nor a hallucination. It was a real volcano spewing lava and flames. The scorching air and earth told him that all of this was real. Sweat poured down like rain. Even after awakening, he was in this state. If an ordinary person had been sucked into the dungeon, they would surely have died without lasting long.
I can get out, right?
Zeon prided himself on being stubborn in his own way. But before this harsh environment he was seeing for the first time in his life, he had no choice but to shrink back. Even so, for now, he had no choice but to move forward. Zeon stopped abruptly. A gigantic river of lava was blocking his path. Even though there was still quite a distance between them, the intense heat felt as if it would burn his entire body. The river of lava was dozens of meters wide. Leaping across it in a single bound was impossible for the current Zeon. Zeon moved in search of a place where the width narrowed. After going upstream for a long while, he found a place where the width was around 10 meters. It was at least a distance worth attempting.
Phew.
Zeon stopped for a moment and took a deep breath. With his current physical condition, he felt as though he could jump it. However, if by any chance he misplaced his footing or lost his balance in midair, he would fall straight into the river of lava. If that happened, he would melt away without leaving even a fragment of bone behind. Even so, Zeon had no choice but to prepare himself to jump. After glaring at the river of lava for a moment, Zeon sprinted with all his strength. Right before the river of lava, he leapt with all his might. Like a bird, Zeon's body flew through the air. It was when Zeon reached the highest point of his leap that something burst through the lava with a great surge, rushing up toward him.
What the?
Zeon looked beneath his feet in shock. A huge gaping maw, bumpy skin filled with flame, a long body like a snake's with 4 short legs attached. It was a crocodile. A giant crocodile hidden in the river of lava, hunting for prey. Each of its teeth was the size of a person's forearm. Countless teeth like that were packed densely inside its mouth. If he was caught by those teeth, Zeon's body would certainly be torn apart in an instant. He was in midair, so there was nowhere to dodge. He tried to use Sandblaster, but the sand was too far away. He would surely lose his life before he could gather it. Zeon twisted his body in the air while gathering the sand. The crocodile's jaws snapped shut with a sound, biting empty air by a hair's breadth before splashing back into the river of lava. But Zeon's situation was not good either. He had narrowly escaped the crocodile's attack, but as the price for that, he had lost his balance and was falling toward the river of lava. In the river of lava, that crocodile had its enormous mouth wide open. If he could not stop his fall, he would be eaten by the crocodile. At that instant, Xian saw floating sand. It was the sand he had gathered moments before. Xian instinctively imagined it. He pictured making a foothold out of the sand floating before his eyes. Imagination became reality. A foothold made of sand formed beneath his falling foot. Xian tapped against it and kicked off the sand foothold, launching himself away without thinking any further. The sand scattered in an instant once its use was done, but thanks to it, Xian was barely able to reach the opposite side, though he landed on his back instead of his feet. The impact felt as though his whole body were breaking apart, and Xian groaned. But he did not even have the luxury of feeling the pain. The giant crocodile roared as it came out of the river of lava and approached Xian. Sticky lava dripped down the crocodile's enormous body.
Damn it, a monster like this.
Xian hurriedly retreated, but the crocodile approached faster than he did. Its legs were short only compared to its enormous body. They were thicker and larger than most logs. Naturally, its walking speed was very fast.
Sandblaster.
Xian fired Sandblaster. However, the stream of sand fired at high pressure failed to inflict any damage on the giant crocodile and melted instead. The giant crocodile was emitting heat as intense as lava itself. Because of that, the sand melted in an instant before it could even touch it.
Insane.
Xian's eyes widened. He had truly not expected his attack to be blocked so futilely. The crocodile launched itself with unbelievable speed and snapped at Xian. Looking at its enormous mouth split wide open, Xian could not react at all. That was when it happened. A rough, hoarse voice suddenly came from the air.
To think you use sand. You have quite an interesting ability.
Without realizing it, Xian looked in the direction of the voice. Someone was falling from the sky, piercing through the volcanic ash. Like a bird with folded wings, the person descended at a terrifying speed, holding an enormous sword in his hand. With the enormous sword leading the way, he collided directly with the giant crocodile. An explosive roar burst out as though a meteor had struck, and a tremendous shockwave swept over the area. The shockwave sent the quietly flowing lava scattering in every direction.
What the?
Xian covered both ears with his hands, his expression full of disbelief. The giant crocodile that had been so threatening was crushed like tofu. Standing on top of the crushed giant crocodile was an old man of tremendous size. From the old man's eyes shot a gaze so frightening that it was hard to believe he was human. The old man asked Xian,
What is your name?
The voice, growling from deep in his belly, was more frightening than the giant crocodile. Xian did not dare look at the old man. That was because everything about the old man frightened him. It was not simply because the old man was large or because his gaze was fierce. From the old man, some kind of force that made people afraid was being emitted with terrifying intensity. It felt as though he were standing naked before an enormous desert storm. The old man was showing him just how small a human being could become when faced with the irresistible power of nature. When Xian could not answer and only trembled, the old man asked again.
Are you a mute cripple? If you do not tell me your name, I'll make you like that flame crocodile.
Xian.
The old man's voice cut through the air.
Xian? What a crippled name.
Even at the old man's mockery, Xian could not offer any objection. If he objected carelessly, he felt as though the sword that had reduced the crocodile to pulp would be swung at him. The old man asked again.
Good, you cripple. How did you enter this dungeon? It should no longer be possible to enter through the entrance I used.
That is.
If you stammer one more time, I'll cut off your head.
Xian swallowed hard.
I came in through an underground shaft.
A shaft?
Yes. I was working at the Mana Stone mine, and the dungeon entrance appeared behind a collapsed wall and dragged me in.
The old man laughed, a sharp, bitter sound.
Keek, it seems the snare activated.
Snare.
Occasionally, there are dungeons where mana becomes oversaturated and reaches the verge of bursting. To protect themselves, they create another entrance and release mana outside. That is the snare. It releases mana while also catching living creatures.
Xian's voice wavered.
Something like that.
The old man laughed again, louder this time.
You are a fellow followed by terrible misfortune. Most people never encounter a snare even once before they die.
The old man openly laughed at Xian's misfortune. Xian could not offer any objection, because just as the old man said, terrible misfortune had been following him. Gathering his courage, Xian asked the old man,
Who are you? Where is this place?
The old man's expression hardened.
My name is Deoden.
Deoden?
Deoden's voice carried absolute certainty.
And from now on, this place will become my hunting ground.
Hunting ground?
At the arrogant words of the old man Deoden, Xian's body trembled. That was because he felt that they were not simple bluster or nonsense. The old man's fierce gaze and all the storm-like madness emitted from him said that it was the truth. That was when it happened. Suddenly, giant crocodiles burst through the lava and revealed themselves. They were beings called flame crocodiles. The flame crocodiles charged with their enormous mouths gaping wide. Even after seeing a sight that made his knees weaken, Deoden laughed.
Crayon.
No sooner had his words ended than the enormous sword stuck in the ground floated gently into the air. Deoden grabbed the sword he had called Crayon. At that instant, a deafening cry burst from Crayon. The sword cry spread throughout the entire dungeon, creating concentric ripples. Xian's face twisted. That was because his heart was pounding violently. It was not because of excitement. Rather, the emotion he felt was closer to displeasure. The cry of the sword was ominously scraping at his nerves. Xian was not the only one to feel that. Perhaps stimulated by the sword cry that stirred their hearts, the flame crocodiles let out ferocious roars. The flame crocodiles were not the only ones stimulated. Monsters appeared from all across the volcanic region. From flying monsters that covered the sky in black to giant monsters larger than the flame crocodiles, all of them were charging toward Deoden. Crayon's sword cry had stimulated every monster that existed inside the dungeon. At the unbelievable sight, Xian could not close his gaping mouth.
Insane.
The truly insane thing happened next. Deoden leapt into the midst of the monsters, with Crayon leading the way. The flame crocodile's enormous body was split in two. The sight of a monster's exceedingly tough flesh being cut apart like a sheet of paper was unreal. It was not only the flame crocodiles. All kinds of monsters whose names he did not know were being mercilessly cut down. Deoden was a storm. As though swept up in an enormous storm, the monsters were blown away. The river of lava flowing along the ground and the volcanic ash filling the air were also caught in the storm called Deoden and sent flying in every direction. What grade is he exactly? It was a level of force that Xian could not believe even while seeing it with his own eyes. He did not seem to be using any particular skill. He was simply relying on the strength inherent to his human body and the greatsword called Crayon as he slaughtered the monsters. Before long, the corpses of monsters were piled high around Deoden. Covered in the monsters' blood and flesh, as he swung Crayon, Deoden laughed, a wild, unstable sound that filled the dungeon. He did not look human at all. He was something wearing a human shell. Xian was overwhelmed by Deoden's madness. He could not move a single finger, nor could he even breathe deeply. A monster resembling a rhinoceros fell last. There were no longer any monsters standing on the ground. Deoden had annihilated the army of monsters all by himself. Yet even then, Deoden's breathing had not become rough in the slightest. Without realizing it, Xian swallowed dryly. That was when it happened. Suddenly a roar erupted from the summit of the volcano. The moment he heard the roar, Xian's mind grew distant. Barely holding on to his consciousness, he saw an enormous monster burst out from the summit of the volcano. At the majesty of the enormous monster, which reminded him of a dragon from myth, Xian could not move. Deoden smiled as he looked at the monster.
So you have come out. Crimson Drake.
It was a giant monster whose body was wrapped in deep blood-red scales. From its head to its tail, it was 30 meters long, and the length of its wings, when fully spread, was even greater than that. Xian trembled. That's not a dragon. Xian trembled at the presence of the drake he was seeing for the first time in his life. At the drake's fear, his mind grew distant, and both his legs shook. It was a wonder he did not collapse onto the ground. A blue aura, ill-suited to the crimson drake's body as it emerged through the lava, hung over its entire form. Monsters of grade B or higher had traits, just like humans. Blood-colored, that is, red light, meant that a monster had a martial-type trait. Conversely, a creature with a blue force field had a magic-type trait. In other words, It meant that even though it was a monster, it could use magic. The Crimson Drake that had now appeared was a monster of grade B, or higher, with a magic-type trait. Deoden tightened his grip on Crayon and said,
That thing is this dungeon's final boss.
Even though he was facing the dungeon's final boss, there was not the slightest sign of intimidation on Deoden's face. Instead, he wore a madness-filled smile, as if he were enjoying himself. Zeon could not understand Deoden at all. He could not tell whether all high-ranking awakened gained that kind of madness, or whether only the mad could become high-ranking awakened. The Crimson Drake flapped its wings and flew into the air. Its target was Deoden. The Crimson Drake flew toward Deoden at terrifying speed. Even though the Crimson Drake had not yet arrived, blades of wind were already swirling. Deoden bent his knees slightly and said,
Cripple.
Yes?
The old man's voice cut sharply.
Survive on your own.
That is.
At that instant, Deoden kicked off the ground and soared. A sonic boom erupted as Deoden broke through the barrier of supersonic speed and appeared in front of the Crimson Drake in an instant. The enormous monster and the small human collided in midair. The aftermath shook the entire dungeon from top to bottom. The quietly flowing lava overflowed as though it had become a tidal wave and splashed in every direction, while the volcano spewed black smoke even more violently. The corpses of the monsters Deoden had killed melted into the lava as they were. The force fields that had protected them from the heat of the volcano while they were alive had vanished upon death. Lava surged toward Zeon as well.
Damn it.
Zeon hurriedly moved to avoid the lava. However, lava surged even toward the place he had dodged to. At this rate, he too would melt in the lava like the other monsters and vanish without a trace. Even at that moment, Deoden and the Crimson Drake were fighting fiercely in midair. The Crimson Drake spat breath, and Deoden swung Crayon to deflect it. The problem was that the Crimson Drake's breath, deflected by Deoden, fell right near Zeon. An explosive roar erupted as lava splashed, and Zeon had to endure the entire aftermath. Zeon grunted, thrashing this way and that like a madman. The lava was surging so terrifyingly, and the situation was so urgent, that he could not think at all about how to use his ability. In order to survive, he had to somehow get away from the place where Deoden and the Crimson Drake were fighting. Zeon leapt over the rivers of lava and ran across the black volcanic rocks. Then suddenly, the volcanic rock he had stepped on collapsed. Beneath the crumbling rock, crimson lava was flowing. If he fell like this, it was over. Zeon instinctively drew in the sand around him. Just as he had avoided the flame crocodile's attack, he created a sand foothold. Zeon made sand footholds one after another and ran. Because he kept creating sand footholds, his mana was quickly depleted. Even so, fortunately, before his mana was completely exhausted, he was able to land on solid volcanic rock. Zeon fell to one knee on the volcanic rock and breathed roughly. His heart felt as though it would burst, and the smell of blood rose from his lungs. It was the after effect of pouring out everything in a single instant. That was when it happened. The entire dungeon shook violently. When Zeon turned his head and looked toward the source, the fight between Deoden and the Crimson Drake was rushing toward its climax.
It ends here.
Together with Deoden's madness-filled shout, tremendous energy gathered into Crayon. In Zeon's eyes, Crayon seemed to grow several times larger in an instant. Deoden threw Crayon at the Crimson Drake. Crayon flew like a meteor and pierced straight through the Crimson Drake's chest. The Crimson Drake let out a mournful scream and plummeted. Its enormous body, over 30 meters long, slammed straight into the lava-covered earth. Deoden descended onto the body of the drake that lay sprawled without strength. The Crimson Drake, whose breath had not yet fully stopped, panted heavily and looked up at Deoden. Looking down at the Crimson Drake, Deoden said,
I scoured the desert for a full year to catch you, to temper Crayon with your heart, so die quietly.
Deoden raised Crayon high into the sky, then drove it straight into the Crimson Drake's heart. At the pain of having its heart pierced, the Crimson Drake writhed. But the Crimson Drake's final struggle was too feeble. Crayon, embedded in the Crimson Drake's heart, was dyed red. As befitted the dungeon's final boss, the Crimson Drake held an enormous amount of fire attribute mana in its heart. Crayon was heating up fiercely with that fire attribute mana from the Crimson Drake. It was to the point that one wondered if it might melt. When the heat reached its peak, Crayon suddenly changed. It separated into individual parts, then began reassembling itself. The reassembled crayon had become larger and sharper. Diodin smiled in satisfaction at crayon's transformation. The Crimson Drake's heart, robbed of all its mana by crayon, lost its light. The Crimson Drake's corpse also lost its force field and dried up wretchedly. Then the dungeon began to crumble. The final boss was the dungeon's origin. Having lost its origin, the dungeon could not maintain its form and had no choice but to perish. A dark red portal appeared before the Crimson Drake's corpse. It was the passage out of the dungeon. Just before stepping into the portal, Diodin turned his head and looked at Xion.
Aren't you leaving, you cripple?
Xion hurriedly followed Diodin into the portal. Once again, tremendous pressure bore down on him, but perhaps because he had experienced it once before, he did not lose consciousness.
Where is this?
He was in the middle of a desert, where sunlight beat down fiercely. Until just moments ago, he had been in a space where a volcano was erupting. But the scenery around him had changed as if by magic. No matter how much he looked around, all he could see was hot, heated sand. There was nothing visible that could help him identify their location. Xion asked Diodin.
Where are we?
Without answering, Diodin grabbed Xion's wrist and twisted it.
Why are you doing this?
I cannot see a rank insignia on your wrist. I clearly saw you using sand.
At the pain of his wrist being crushed, Xion groaned. It felt as though his arm had been caught in an enormous press. Xion tried to put strength into his arm and pull it free, but it was no use. Diodin's strength was not at a level he could handle. At the terrible pain, Xion fell to his knees. He understood what people meant when they said that if something hurt too much, not even a scream would come out. Releasing the arm he had been gripping tightly, Diodin said,
Then again, there are many awakened, so it is not that strange for a freak like you to exist.
Only then did Xion let out the groan he had been suppressing. Even so, the pain did not fade. For a moment, Xion lost his reason and shouted,
You dogshit, old man. You almost broke my arm.
Diodin scoffed.
You really are crippled and fragile.
Ong. Unable to hold back his anger, Xion unleashed Sand Blaster. Sand fired at high pressure slammed into Diodin's chest. However, Diodin's chest was not left with so much as a scratch. Diodin brushed the sand off his chest and laughed.
It is certain you awakened an ability to control sand.
So what? Did you contribute anything to it?
Diodin replied.
From now on, you are coming with me, cripple.
My name is Xion. I'm not a cripple. You're the crippled old bastard.
If you are weak, you are all cripples.
Xion started.
You.
If you say one more word there, I will tear your mouth apart.
Xion closed his mouth without realizing it. Only then did his reason return. The old man before him was a monster who had hunted the Crimson Drake, the final boss of the dungeon. He was not a being to whom Xion's common sense applied. He had lost his reason for a moment and talked back, but from the beginning, Xion was no match for Diodin. In Diodin's eyes, Xion was something less than an ant, a worthless existence he could press down and kill with a single finger. No matter what Diodin did, Xion could not even resist. Diodin suddenly looked at Crayon and said,
Yes, it seems he is only about grade F for now. It will take a long time before he becomes useful. I only need to work him harshly. If he does not die, he will grow stronger.
The sight of him muttering to himself while looking at Crayon did not seem normal at all. I've really gotten caught by a properly insane old man. It was a desert with nowhere to hide. He could not even dream of running away. Until he built up his strength, he had no choice but to accompany Diodin. Diodin said,
Follow me.
Yes.
Xion let out a sigh and followed Diodin. Having no strength is a sin. Diodin did not seem to feel heat. Even while walking through a desert without a single patch of shade, he showed no sign of exhaustion or difficulty from the heat. By contrast, Xion, who followed him, was on the verge of dying. The sand, into which his feet sank up to the ankles, gnawed away at his stamina, and the sun beating down fiercely tormented him. His entire body had long since been drenched in sweat. His breathing naturally grew rough and his steps slowed. That was when it happened. Diodin scoffed.
What an idiot. You cannot even use 1% of the ability you possess properly.
What do you mean?
Diodin replied.
Did you not gain the ability to control sand?
So?
Diodin continued.
Use the sand. Why are you walking so laboriously?
Do you think that's as easy as saying it? I only awakened the day before yesterday.
What of it?
Diodin said coldly.
Seriously.
Xian flared up. Then Diodin stopped and looked back. The expression on his face as he looked at Xian was plainly one of contempt. That gaze made anger surge up in Xian once more.
I'm grade F. I'm not a high-ranking awakened like you.
That is why you are a cripple. What does it matter if you are grade F or grade S? Do you think everyone is born grade S from the beginning? Of course, there may be some bastards like that. Those bastards were born blessed. But because you were not blessed, are you simply going to give up and live that way? In the eyes of others, you will look blessed enough. So, stop whining and think about how you can use your ability. What is the point of having all 4 limbs intact? Your head is crippled.
Can't you really stop saying cripple?
If you do not want to hear the word cripple, you will have to break open that stiff head of yours first. Until then, you are the worst cripple among cripples.
In the end, Xian could not even recover his dignity and had to close his mouth. Diodin turned away and said,
It is your ability. Naturally, you should know it best. So you must also find out how to grow it and how to use it.
What if I cannot find out?
Then you will die.
What?
Either I will kill you, or that sun will kill you. It will be one of the two.
With those words, Diodin began walking again. 2 lines of footprints stretched long behind him where he passed. Xian glared at the back of Diodin's head. A cripple? Break open my stiff head first? Something surged up from deep inside his chest. It was anger. Anger toward Diodin and anger toward himself. The 2 kinds of anger combined and burned fiercely. Xian gritted his teeth. Fine, I'll do just that. I'll make sure you can never call me a cripple again. Strengthening his resolve, Xian followed behind Diodin, and he thought, what I have is the ability to control sand, so I have to use sand. Even after awakening as a Sandmancer, he had not actually grasped how far his ability went. He had only used it in makeshift ways to escape each crisis as it came. He had to use this chance to clearly understand his limits, and he had to fiercely consider how far he could make use of it. Xian moved his mana. Then the sand in the area was drawn to him and moved. Like iron filings drawn to a magnet, the sand was pulled towards Xian. Roughly a 5-meter radius centered on me. The closer the sand was, the faster it moved, while sand farther away moved slowly. It could move, but its reaction was slow. This was also a problem he had to think about. But Xian pushed that concern aside. There was something he had to resolve before that. The problem was the sand into which his feet sank up to the ankles. Every time he lifted a foot, it drained an enormous amount of his stamina. If he could not solve this, Xian would surely fall behind in the desert. What if I condensed the sand and hardened the place where my feet step? It was the method he had used when crossing the river of lava. Xian immediately hardened the sand beneath his feet. Walking became much easier. It was not tiring, as though he were walking across a stone-paved floor. But there was a problem. The consumption of mana was extreme. Each time he hardened the ground, mana left him in chunks. At this rate, before he had gone a few dozen more meters, all his mana would be depleted. Xian abandoned that method. That was because he could clearly see what would happen to him after all his mana was exhausted. I'll be baked dry under the sunlight and become a mummy. Or before that, I'll become a monster's food. Just imagining it was horrifying. Xian thought of the next method. My mana reservoir is not large yet. With a method that just consumes mana blindly like this, I can't endure in the desert. So I have to think of an efficient method that reduces mana consumption. What Xian thought of next was concentrating mana in both legs. Just by concentrating mana there, his steps became lighter, and his stamina consumption decreased noticeably. However, Xian had to discard this method too. It was immediately useful, but it was not a method that used sand, his own ability. He was a Sandmancer. If so, he had to polish an ability that used sand. It would be difficult right now, but considering the future, it could not be helped. The third thing Xian chose was a method of moving the sand. Moving the sand in contact with the soles of his feet. The size of my soles and about 1 centimeter thick. Xian concentrated his mind. Using his control in a limited space like this was more difficult than using it broadly. As his mana concentrated excessively, the sand instead lost cohesion and scattered uselessly. Each time that happened, Xian also lost his balance and slammed into the sand. Xian spat out the sand and rose. His mouth was already dry because he had not been able to drink water, and the sand made it even drier. Xian's face showed clear signs of exhaustion. Far in the distance, he could see Diodin. Diodin had not looked back even once. It seemed as though he had no interest whatsoever in whether Xian lived or died. That sight made Xian even angrier.
Whose fault is it that I ended up like this?
Anger surged up again. If not for Diodin, he thought, he would be resting comfortably at the Mana Stone mine by now. Because he was in so much pain and hardship, resentment and anger toward Diodin filled him, leaving him unable to judge rationally. Xian felt himself slowly going mad. If he did not find a method quickly, he was certain he would truly lose his mind. Again, Xian focused once more on the sand beneath his feet. The sand carrying his body slowly began to move, like the wheels of a train rolling along rails. However, the speed was extremely slow. That was because Xian was not yet accustomed to handling mana. If his concentration scattered even slightly, the sand lost its movement and scattered uselessly. Each time that happened, Xian fell headfirst into the ground. He grew more and more exhausted, but Xian did not give up. Again and again he rose and focused on the sand beneath his feet. His efforts were not in vain. He gradually grew accustomed to handling sand. The sand carrying Xian moved forward much more smoothly. In a way, it looked as though the sand was moving his body on its own. But this was the crystallization of Xian's efforts. It was a movement made possible because he had fallen countless times and agonized over it. However, there was still quite a bit of wasted mana. At this rate, he could not endure for very long. Xian focused his mind and tried to operate his mana efficiently. Thanks to that, his mana was maintained by a hair's breadth, and Xian was able to move across the sand much more comfortably. Even without turning back, Diodin noticed Xian's condition. The flow of mana, the movement of the air, and the sound of Xian's breathing conveyed a great deal of information to him. Even without seeing it with his eyes, he knew what state Xian was in, Diodin muttered.
He has become a slightly useful cripple.
Although by his standards, Xian was still far from enough. Xian's stamina had reached its limit. He no longer had even the mana left to operate. No matter how sparingly he operated his mana, the amount he possessed was not very large to begin with. The sand beneath his feet no longer moved as he wanted. Xian had never once pushed himself this hard before. Behind him, Xian was staggering as if he might collapse at any moment. But Diodin had not stopped or looked back even once. Not wanting to show weakness before Diodin, Xian gritted his teeth and followed. But now he was truly at his limit. This dog-shit old man. The strength left Xian's legs, and he toppled over. As he lay with his face buried in the sand, breathing harshly, he sensed someone's presence. Diodin had come back. When Xian barely raised his head and looked, Diodin was looking down at him with an expression of contempt.
Useless bastard.
Xian grunted.
Because of a cripple like you, I have wasted time for nothing.
Diodin sat down beside Xian. He took 2 pieces of jerky from his clothes. He put one in his own mouth and threw the other to Xian. It meant Xian should get up and eat it on his own. But right now, Xian did not even have the strength to get up. His mouth was completely dry from not having drunk a single sip of water all day. Eating jerky in this state itself was impossible. If he could not recover his strength like this and continued lying face down, even his life would be in danger. Diodin knew that fact too. Even so, he left Xian alone. Chewing the jerky, Diodin said,
The old world was peaceful. Back then, even if you were a little weak, even if you were inferior to others, there was no problem surviving. It was still a world where common sense worked, and consideration for others was not strange. But as you know, the world changed and became one where the strong prey on the weak. If you are weak, you get eaten, and the one who survives monopolizes everything. It hurts, it is hard, then give up. Once you die, it becomes easy.
At his venomous words, Xian gritted his teeth. He had not lived very long, but he had met all kinds of people. Yet none of them had spoken as sharply as Diodin. It felt as though a dagger was digging through his chest.
If you want to be comfortable, keep lying there. If not, if you want to live even while suffering pain at the very limit, then get up with your own strength. Cripple.
With those words, Diodin closed his mouth. He did not even glance at Xian and only chewed his jerky. Diodin, too, had not drunk a single sip of water all day. That was why he did not eat the jerky quickly. He let his saliva soften it and chewed slowly, preventing his throat from growing dry. It was know-how he had gained from surviving in the desert for a long time. Before he knew it, the sun was setting. When night came, the temperature of the desert dropped rapidly. It fell below freezing in an instant, and if one did not keep warm, one would suffer hypothermia and die. Xian knew that fact too. I'm not going to die. I can't die. Xian crawled across the ground. Like an earthworm, he wriggled his body and moved forward little by little. After several attempts, he finally had the jerky before his eyes. Xian opened his mouth as he was and bit down on the jerky. The sand stuck to the jerky entered his mouth along with it, but he did not care. Xian slowly chewed the jerky. Because no saliva came out, the act of chewing the jerky itself was painful. Even so, he tenaciously chewed it. After chewing for a long time, he barely managed to swallow it down his throat. When the jerky entered his stomach, a little strength returned. Riding that momentum, Xian sat up. Then Diodin threw him another piece of jerky. Xian did not say thank you and simply chewed the jerky. He felt vitality slowly returning to his body. At the same time, his mana also rose. As if seeing through Xian's physical condition, Diodin said,
The body and mana are not separate. Only when the body is strong does mana flow in easily. So if you want to become stronger, you must not cease training your body for even a moment.
Xian nodded silently. That was because he felt it in his bones. While he had been collapsed, he had tried to gather mana. However, mana had not easily returned to his exhausted body. If he had not eaten the jerky and recovered at least a little strength, his mana would still have been crawling along the bottom. Once his mana filled somewhat, he felt as though he might live. Only then did Xian let out a sigh of relief. After surviving a brush with death, the world came into view again. Before he knew it, countless stars were floating in the desert sky where darkness had fallen. The stars spread out like a carpet, giving off beautiful light. Xian stared blankly at the sight. When he had been in Neo Sol, he had never had the luxury of seeing such a scene. He had never thought the stars were beautiful either. But after nearly dying and coming back to life, he had become rather sentimental. What brought Xian, lost in sentiment, back to reality was Diodin's voice.
My friend.
Friend? There was no one here besides Diodin and himself. Naturally, there was no one who could be called a friend either. Xian carefully looked at Diodin. The one Diodin was speaking to was none other than his sword, Crayon. Is he insane, or is that sword an ego sword? The sight of him conversing with Crayon, which he had stuck in the ground before his feet, was not normal no matter who saw it. Whether he knew of Xian's gaze or not, Diodin continued conversing with the sword.
Yes, that place would be good. I still have not caught the boss there. It has been so long that my memory was vague. Thank you, my friend.
As if he had finished the conversation, Diodin looked at Xian. At that instant, Xian felt a chill he could not identify. No matter how much he had awakened, enduring the cold of the desert was absolutely not easy. Because of that, Xian had to spend the whole night shivering in the cold with his eyes open. By contrast, Diodin slept deeply in a comfortable posture. He slept so comfortably that Xian wanted to punch him in the face. Diodin opened his eyes in time with the rising sun. The first thing Diodin did after waking was squeeze and drink the dew that had gathered on his clothes. Only then did Xian understand why Diodin had slept with his clothes spread wide. Belatedly, Xian also drank the dew gathered on his clothes. However, the amount was far less than the dew gathered on Diodin's clothes. If you know this kind of trick, you could have told me. He felt resentful toward Diodin for no reason, and he realized it. Everything about Diodin was suited to survival. Even each of his smallest actions was all for the sake of survival. Xian made up his mind. I have to learn everything from him, even the smallest things. If he copied everything Diodin did, someday he too might grow to a similar level. No, to a level beyond him. Xian wrung out and drank every last drop of dew gathered on his clothes. Only then was his thirst completely quenched.
Let's go,
Diodin said as he rose. Xian also nodded and stood. He did not ask where they were going. That was because he knew that even if he asked, Diodin would not answer anyway. Although he had known Diodin for only one day, he now felt he roughly understood what kind of person he was. He was an extremely self-centered and unfriendly man. He would never kindly teach someone or show consideration for others. He took Xian along, but his way of thinking was that Xian had to survive on his own. To survive under such a man, Xian had no choice but to read the situation quickly and respond. Before he knew it, Diodin had gone far ahead. Fortunately, all his mana had recovered overnight. Xian used the skill he had realized yesterday. He named the newly acquired skill Sandwalk. What Xian paid the most attention to was, of course, mana management. Because yesterday he had exhausted his mana and approached the threshold of death, he had realized that mana management was the most important thing. It would be good if I could replenish mana as much as I consume it. Is there no method? Diodin seemed like he would know a method. But it was obvious that even if Xian asked, he would not answer. In the end, just as he had done until now, he had to figure it out or realize it on his own. While using Sandwalk, Xian continued thinking about how to improve it. Not much time had passed since the sun rose, but the sand of the desert had already heated up like iron plates. The heat rising from the ground and the sun beating down from the sky tormented Xian terribly. Even so, Xian gritted his teeth and endured it. As he endured and endured, his patience grew. And Sandwalk became much more natural as well. After walking like that all day, the sun had set before he knew it. Only then did Diodin stop, and Xian could also catch his breath. Fortunately, this time, his mana did not become exhausted. However, Xian's face showed clear signs of fatigue. Using Sandwalk while managing his mana all day had pushed his body and mind to their limits. He looked as if he might collapse from exhaustion at any moment. But Xian forced himself to endure. To him, Diodin threw a piece of jerky. This time, he did not have to suffer the humiliation of picking it up with his mouth. Xian held the jerky in his hand and tore off small pieces. He chewed slowly, softening the jerky enough before swallowing it. Naturally, the time it took to eat could only grow longer. When Xian had eaten about half the jerky, he glanced at Diodin. He thought he had eaten slowly enough himself, but Diodin had only eaten 1/3 of his. He had much more left than Xian. At the inexplicable feeling of defeat, Xian bit his lip. He deliberately chewed the jerky more slowly than Diodin. As he ate that slowly, nearly 30 minutes passed just to eat one piece of jerky. But I'm still hungry. Xian had not yet finished growing. There was no way a single piece of jerky would fill his stomach. This was the age when he became hungry again as soon as he turned away after eating. Even so, he could not ask Diodin for more jerky. Xian's pride would not allow that. Xian decided to hold his starving stomach and try to sleep. Before that, there was something he had to do first. Xian took off the clothes he was wearing and spread them on the ground. It was to gather enough morning dew. The next thing he did was make a sleeping place. For Diodin, who possessed an ability difficult for Xian to even imagine, the cold of the desert was nothing. But for Xian, it was a matter of survival. The solution Xian came up with was a bunker. Fortunately, he still had a little mana left. When Xian raised his control, the sand moved on its own. A pit large enough for one person to enter was created. Xian entered the pit he had made. After that, he moved the sand again and covered the top of the pit. Desert sand had no cohesion, so it did not clump together. Normally, if one covered it with sand like this, it would have been natural for it to collapse at once. However, the sand held firm like a roof made of wood. That was because Xian had increased the cohesion of the sand. Mana was consumed when making the bunker, but once it was completed, he no longer needed to use mana. Only after completing the bunker did Xian let out a sigh of relief. He felt regret, thinking he would have slept more comfortably last night if he had done this then. Still, it was fortunate that he could sleep comfortably today at least. Suddenly, he thought of Diodin. He wondered if he should tell Diodin to come in even now. But soon he shook his head. In any case, Diodin was not someone who would listen just because he spoke. If he truly could not endure it, he would crawl in on his own. Whatever happens, happens. Thinking that, Xian tried to sleep. Outside, the temperature was dropping rapidly, but inside the bunker, it was quite warm. The sand, which had been heated fiercely throughout the day, was providing him with enough warmth. Thanks to that, he was able to sleep much more comfortably than yesterday. What woke Xian, who had been sleeping deeply, was a strange sensation. A faint vibration was traveling through the sand.
What is this?
Xian sat up and placed his hand on the floor. Then he felt the vibration even more strongly. Xian left the bunker and looked for Diodin. Diodin was already awake. He had crayons stuck in the ground and was looking straight ahead. Xian also moved his gaze to where Diaden was looking. All he could see was thick darkness. It was the darkest time before sunrise. It was impossible to distinguish anything. But that only applied to ordinary people. Dioden's sight, which surpassed limits, was piercing through the darkness beyond. The vibration grew stronger and stronger. Xian's eyes trembled. Dozens, no, at least hundreds. Dioden opened his mouth.
Survive on your own, cripple.
His face, wearing a madness-filled smile, somehow looked excited, like a wicked child before setting fire to something. But Xian could not laugh. That was because he knew Dioden truly would not help him. That made his stubbornness rise even more. Fine, I'll survive no matter what. The vibration grew more intense, and at last, they pierced through the darkness and revealed themselves. Hundreds of pairs of eyes were approaching Dioden and Xian at great speed. Dioden said,
It is a pack of great horned hyenas. They are nocturnal creatures that chew up everything without leaving even a single bone fragment behind, so it would be best to be careful not to get caught by their teeth. By the time you come to your senses, you will be torn to pieces inside their bellies.
You insane old man.
Great horned hyenas lived and hunted in packs. The leader of the pack was a female, much larger and stronger than the males. Like a lion, she even had a mane around her neck. She was a monster whose height from forepaw to shoulder alone exceeded 2 meters, and whose length from head to tail reached 5 meters. They lived in packs ranging from as few as dozens to as many as hundreds, and a considerable number among them were cubs born from the alpha female. It was a matriarchal bloodline society. Naturally, all the great horned hyenas obeyed the alpha female's commands absolutely. Great horned hyenas were nocturnal. In order to survive in the scorching desert, they had naturally come to move at night. The great horned hyenas roared and charged in with terrifying force. As befitting creatures that hunted in enormous packs, they had neither fear nor caution. That was because in the face of their large-scale wave tactics, most monsters or awakened were swept away in an instant. Most of the great horned hyenas targeted the large Dioden, but some charged at Xian.
Damn it.
Xian cursed. He hurriedly unleashed Sand Blaster. A torrent of sand fired at high pressure smashed the head of the great horned hyena in the lead. Even though their companion died right in front of them, the great horned hyenas did not care at all.
Huh.
Xian cried out. He fired Sand Blaster in succession. The power of Sand Blaster was tremendous. One shot sent one beast away for certain. The problem was that there were far too many great horned hyenas to kill them one at a time like that. Killing them one by one would not let him escape this crisis. While firing Sand Blaster, Xian thought desperately. One isn't enough. I have to fire at least 5. Only then can I roughly balance things out. The problem was mana. He had to fire many Sand Blasters while managing his mana efficiently. Can I do it? No, it was something he had to do. There was no time to think or hesitate. Xian swung his hand. Then 5 streams of sand rose from the desert and flew toward the great horned hyenas. 5 great horned hyenas shrieked and tumbled across the ground. All of them had holes the size of coins in their heads. He had divided one Sand Blaster into 5. It was to manage his mana. Instead, in order to maximize its power, he compressed the 5 divided Sand Blasters thinly. That was why the great horned hyenas' heads had not burst apart, but had holes pierced through them instead. The first time was difficult, but from the second time onward, it became easier. That was because he only had to walk along the path he had already opened. Sand Blasters erupted rapidly. 5 Sand Blasters at a time pierced holes through the heads of 5 great horned hyenas. It seemed he could barely hold on. Only then did he have the luxury of looking at Dioden. When Xian turned his head toward Dioden, his eyes widened. Insane, Xian breathed. Dioden laughed wildly as he swung Crayon.
More.
Dioden was slaughtering the great horned hyenas around him. More than 100 had already died. He was not using any special skill like Xian. He was merely swinging Crayon, then swinging it again. Each time, 3 or 4 great horned hyenas were sliced apart. Blood sprayed and chunks of flesh flew. The red sand of the desert, already crimson, was stained with blood. At times, a great horned hyena succeeded in biting Dioden's forearm or calf. However, their teeth could not sink into Dioden's flesh. Dioden's body was harder than steel. Instead, the great horned hyena's teeth broke. Deoden laughed.
That tickles.
He grabbed the head of the great horned hyena, biting his thigh with his hand. Then he squeezed hard. The tough skull of the great horned hyena cracked and shattered like a cracker. He threw the great horned hyena in his hand at the other great horned hyenas. The great horned hyenas shrieked and barked as they tangled together and rolled across the ground. Their legs bent unnaturally, and their bellies burst, spilling their entrails. Filled with madness, Deoden slaughtered the great horned hyenas. Not a single great horned hyena dared to fight against Deoden. With the situation having reached this point, the alpha female, who had only been watching until now, stepped forward. A blue force field hung over the alpha female's entire body. It meant she had a magic-type ability, and was at least grade B or higher. Sparks flew from the horn on the alpha female's head. It seemed that among magic types, she knew how to use lightning magic. At that instant, lightning shot out from her horn. The lightning that split through space reached Deoden in an instant. Deoden laughed. He swung his hand as though snatching a fly and caught the lightning. The lightning that had brightly illuminated the night sky vanished inside his palm. Only then did an intense sense of crisis assault the alpha female. She had realized that he was on a different level from any opponent they had hunted until now. The alpha female roared and gave the order to retreat. There was nothing more foolish than struggling against an existence one could not handle. Half the pack had already been swept away. If more of them died, she could not guarantee the survival of the pack. The alpha female's judgment was extremely appropriate. The problem was that Deoden had no intention of letting the great horned hyena pack go.
All of you fucking die.
Deoden roared. He threw crayon. The weapon spun at a terrifying speed and cut down everything it caught. The mournful screams of the great horned hyenas echoed through the night sky. Zeon froze at the sight, too gruesome to bear. But Deoden's event was not yet over. Deoden pushed off the ground and leaped into the air. Crayon, which had slaughtered countless great horned hyenas, flew back to Deoden. Holding Crayon, Deoden plunged straight down toward the alpha female. Deoden fell like a meteor. Its power, too, was as tremendous as a meteor striking the earth. Deoden crashed into the ground. Together with the alpha female's desperate scream, the sand in the area exploded. A moment later, the sand that had risen like waves settled, and the scene was revealed. The alpha female had been crushed so badly that her shape could not even be recognized. The only thing intact was the great horn on her head. Deoden stood with one foot on the alpha female's corpse. Even after going through such an intense battle, there was not a trace of fatigue on Deoden's face. Instead, he was smiling as if refreshed. That sight did not seem human at all. Zeon froze. He did not dare even breathe loudly. He had been overwhelmed by Deoden's strength. Is he really human? It didn't seem like he used any special skill. When one awakened, one learned unique skills. An awakened displayed their greatest ability precisely when using their unique skills. Naturally, using a skill against a powerful monster like the alpha female would be far more effective. But Deoden denied such common sense entirely. Without using any skill, he had crushed the alpha female to death with only the strength of his own body. Zeon trembled. He could not believe that a human could be this strong. No awakened in Neo soul could display this kind of power with their physical strength alone. That was when it happened. Deoden turned his head and looked at Zeon.
You somehow survived.
Deoden laughed. Zeon did not dare answer and merely nodded. Deoden smirked, then collected the alpha female's horn.
A great horned hyena's horn is hard, so it has many uses. Since it even has a lightning trait, if it is refined well, it should become a fine weapon,
he said. He looked at the horn for a moment, then reached his hand into the air. Then the horn in his hand vanished, as if it had been a lie. Subspace. He isn't a martial type, but a magic type. Zeon was shocked. Everything Deoden had shown until now had been the fighting style of a martial type. Yet that same man was using subspace, which only an extremely small number of magic type awakened were said to be able to use. He felt as if his common sense were being denied from the ground up. At the same time, he was puzzled. Did Deoden, who already had a weapon called Crayon, really need another weapon? But he did not dare ask. Deoden put Crayon away, then took out a small sword instead. He tossed a dagger to Zeon as well and said,
From now on, prepare what you will eat yourself.
What?
Zeon asked.
Most of a great horned hyena's muscles are poisonous. The only exception is the flank meat. There is no poison here, so it can be dried and eaten.
Diaoden explained. He skillfully carved away part of a great horned hyena's flank meat using the small sword. There was not much of it. It was barely the size of an adult's palm. Xian watched closely the part Diaoden cut out, then copied him. From experience, he knew that Diaoden would not explain any more than this. He had no choice but to pick it up by watching. He realized that the jerky he had eaten until now had actually been monster meat. So he hunted monsters like this and made jerky. He felt no particular repulsion. He had grown up in the slums where food had always been scarce. If something was edible, he ate it without discrimination. That was more advantageous for survival. Xian imitated Diaoden as best as he could. Diaoden cut off only enough meat to eat for a few days. That was because when it ran out, he could simply hunt again. Xian was different. He was not strong like Diaoden, so he had to prepare thoroughly. It was advantageous to secure as much meat as possible. Xian obtained nearly 30 pieces of meat. He wanted to cut out more, but he had nowhere to store it, so he stopped there. Xian took off his upper garment and wrapped the meat in it. Then he made it into a bundle and carried it on his back. Diaoden smirked.
You're using your head somewhat.
Perhaps because he had put him through harsh treatment for 2 days, Xian was finally using his head a little. But he still had far to go. To become truly useful, he had to be worked much longer. And very harshly at that, Diaoden said,
If you have gathered everything, let's go. Before the others smell the blood and come.
He was not leaving because he was afraid. He was leaving because it would be annoying. Xian nodded and followed behind Diaoden. He also did not want to remain any longer in this place filled with the smell of blood. Before he knew it, the sun was rising. The carnage revealed beneath the sunlight was even more horrifying. Birds that had already caught the scent of corpses were circling in the sky, and still more monsters would gather to enjoy the feast. That was the law of the desert. The strong devoured the weak, and the dead became food for other beasts. No being could escape this law. While following Diaoden, Xian was learning the laws of the desert one by one. As always, Diaoden went ahead without even glancing at Xian. To catch up to him, Xian used Sandwalk. Because he had consumed a great deal of mana during the night, he had thought it would be difficult to use Sandwalk. But unexpectedly, it was not that hard. He had more mana left than expected, and operating it had become far smoother. It's because of last night's battle. The experience of fighting with the resolve to stake life and death, combined with mana operation pushed to the limit, had clearly brought about rapid growth. I've grown stronger, and I'll keep growing stronger from now on. Xian looked at Diaoden's back as he walked ahead. He did not know why Diaoden was taking him along, but one thing was clear. As long as he followed him, he would definitely grow stronger. As long as he survived, Xian diligently followed.